Maybe this way she'll learn her place. The husband laughed as he watched his mistress, who had just slapped his wife across the face. But minutes later, the wife began her revenge. What country are you watching from? We love reading your comments and knowing where you're joining us from for this story. While the sound of keyboards echoed through the silent office, Zelani signed the last document. Her hands trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from the adrenaline coursing through her veins. After years of humiliation, the moment had finally arrived. The clock on the wall read 3 a.m. In a few hours, Cassius Sterling would wake up to discover that his perfect world had completely collapsed. Zelani closed the folder containing the newly signed papers, and for the first time in years, she smiled. It was a smile she hadn't shown anyone, a smile that carried the weight of a meticulously planned revenge. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. But to understand how she had reached this point, we must go back to the beginning of this story. 6 months before that decisive night, the alarm clock rang at 6:30 a.m, just as it had every day for 15 years. Zelani slipped silently out of bed, careful not to wake Cassius, who was sleeping soundly beside her. Her movements were precise and calculated, the result of years perfecting the art of being invisible in her own home. She walked lightly to the bathroom, her bare feet barely touching the cold marble floor that Cassius had chosen when remodeling the house without even consulting her. The bathroom mirror light reflected her image. At 40, Zelani retained a serene but worn beauty. Her deep, dark eyes had lost some of their innate shine, and her textured hair, which she once wore loose in glorious long twists, was now always pulled back into an impeccable, severe bun. Cassius had achieved his goal. He had turned the vibrant, dreaming woman she once was into a shadow of herself. After showering and putting on one of her discreet two-piece suits, Zelani went down to the kitchen to make breakfast. The house, decorated with luxury finishes that Cassius bragged about to his guests, had become a gilded cage for her. As she brewed the coffee and toasted the artisan bread, she remembered the early years of their marriage, back when she still believed that Cassius's constant criticisms were just his way of helping her be a better person. The sound of footsteps on the stairs snapped her out of her thoughts. Cassius came down already dressed in a bespoke suit, checking his cell phone. At 45, he was still an attractive man, with his fade perfectly groomed and that smile that had captivated half the business world of Chicago. That same smile he now used in private to humiliate her. "Good morning, sweetheart," Zelani said, with the smile she had perfected over the years. A smile devoid of any genuine emotion, a mere habit of compliance. Cassius barely looked up from his phone. "You haven't forgotten I have an important meeting at 9. I hope my blue shirt is pressed, and don't bother me during the day with your trivialities." Zelani felt the familiar sting in her chest, but her expression didn't change. "Of course, everything is ready, and your breakfast is served." Cassius sat at the table without a word of thanks and began to eat while checking his emails. Zelani remained standing, watching him. There was a familiarity in his posture, in the movement of his eyes scanning the screen. In recent months, she had noticed changes in his behavior. He came home later, smiled more often during his phone calls, and had started paying renewed attention to his appearance. "How's that little project of yours going? Making clothes?" Cassius asked, feigning indifference. But Zelani recognized the prelude to a humiliation instantly. "It's going well. This week I finished 3 gowns for clients in the neighborhood." Cassius's loud laughter made Zelani feel small. "Clients in the neighborhood? Zelani, you're 40 years old. Are you still playing at being a fashion designer? Don't you think it's time to grow up and dedicate yourself to something more serious?" Zelani clenched her fists behind her back, but kept her voice serene. "It's something I enjoy, and it gives me some extra income." "Extra income," Cassius said with disdain. "Earning $50 for a dress isn't extra income. It's pocket change. But I suppose for someone who has never had real ambitions, it must seem like a lot of money." Every word was like a slap, but Zelani had learned to take them without showing pain. However, something inside her had begun to shift. It was no longer just about enduring the humiliation. It was about observing, studying, and understanding exactly who the man was that she had shared 15 years of her life with. Cassius finished his breakfast and headed for the door. "I'll be late tonight. I have a business dinner. Don't wait up." Zelani saw him off with a kiss on the cheek, which he received with indifference. When the door closed, she stood motionless for a few seconds, breathing deeply. Then, with deliberate movements, she went to the house computer and turned it on. Cassius believed she was a simple woman, technologically illiterate, but he gravely underestimated his wife. Over the following days, Zelani maintained her usual routine, but with a difference. Now, every conversation, every gesture, every detail of Cassius's life was carefully observed and recorded in her mind. She began keeping a journal, not of emotions, but of concrete facts, times, phone calls, behavioral changes, names he mentioned carelessly. It was during one of those afternoons of silent observation that Naomi appeared in her life. Cassius had come home with several colleagues for a work meeting, and she was among them. Naomi was a 32-year-old architect with a modern, aggressive beauty that contrasted sharply with Zelani's quiet elegance. During the meeting, Zelani played her role of the perfect wife, serving coffee and appetizers to the guests, but she immediately noticed the way Naomi looked at Cassius, and more importantly, the way he looked back at her. There was an evident chemistry between them, a complicity that went beyond a simple professional relationship. "Thank you, Mrs. Sterling," Naomi said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes when Zelani poured her coffee. "How lucky Cassius is to have such a devoted wife." The word devoted was pronounced with barely disguised disdain. Zelani smiled politely and continued serving the others, but she caught the message perfectly. Naomi not only knew her place in Cassius's life, but felt superior to her. That night, after the guests left, Zelani pretended to be asleep when Cassius got into bed. She heard him checking his phone and saw the screen's light illuminate his face. He was smiling in a way he hadn't smiled at her in years. When he finally fell asleep, Zelani got up in silence and went to her studio in the basement. There, surrounded by fabrics and patterns, Zelani allowed herself to feel the rage she had repressed for years. But it wasn't a destructive rage. It was a cold, calculating anger. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. "Sequoia, it's Zelani. I know it's late, but can we talk about something important? Could we meet tomorrow?" Sequoia had been her sorority sister at Howard University and was now one of the most respected attorneys in the city. They had lost touch during Zelani's marriage, but now was the time to reclaim that friendship. The following days were a mix of seemingly normal routines and secret preparations. During the day, Zelani maintained her role as the submissive wife, but at night she investigated, planned, and prepared. She discovered that Cassius had started leaving important documents carelessly on his desk, allowing her to review them while he slept. That was how she discovered something that completely changed her perspective on her marriage. Some of Cassius's most successful projects had been developed on land that was technically jointly owned by both of them, yet he had managed the contracts as if he were the sole owner. Zelani had signed papers for years, trusting her husband without reading them fully, but now she realized that legally she was entitled to a considerable fortune. Preparations for the awards gala began 3 weeks before the event. Cassius had been nominated as one of the most outstanding architects of the year, and of course he expected Zelani to accompany him. However, his expectations regarding his wife's appearance were specific and humiliating. "I hope you don't wear one of your embarrassing rags," he said one morning during breakfast. "You know how these events are. All the important people will be there, and I can't let you make a bad impression on my account." Zelani decided to design and make her own gown for the occasion. It was an ambitious project, a midnight blue evening gown with hand-embroidered gold details that took weeks to complete. But every stitch was made with a purpose, every detail designed to prove she was much more than Cassius believed. While she sewed late into the night, Zelani wasn't just planning the details of the dress, but also the moves she would execute in the coming weeks. Sequoia had confirmed that her legal analysis was correct. Zelani was entitled to a substantial portion of Cassius's assets, and with the right strategy, she could claim much more than he could ever imagine. The night before the event, Zelani was in her studio putting the final touches on the dress. Cassius came down, probably to make some derogatory comment about her work, but he was left speechless for a moment upon seeing the finished gown. "Not bad," he said finally, though his tone couldn't hide his surprise. "I guess after so much time you had to learn something." Zelani didn't respond. She hung the dress carefully and headed for the stairs, but before going up, she stopped and turned toward Cassius. "Tomorrow will be a very special night," she said with a smile he couldn't interpret. That night, Zelani stayed awake until very late, staring at the ceiling of her bedroom. Cassius slept deeply beside her, completely oblivious to what was coming. Zelani got up quietly, went to the bathroom, and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back was no longer the same one who had accepted years of humiliation. There was a determination in her eyes she had never felt before. "Tomorrow," she told herself, "tomorrow, everything changes." She went back to bed, but didn't sleep. She watched Cassius's serene face as he slept. There was something almost poetic about the fact that he was resting peacefully, unaware that this would be the last night of his supposed superiority. Zelani knew that after the awards gala, nothing would ever be the same. The day of the event dawned with a clear sky and crisp air that seemed to foreshadow a positive change. Zelani woke up early as usual, but this time there was something different in her movements. Every gesture was more decisive, every step firmer. The time had come to take off the mask of submission she had worn for years. As she prepared for what would be the most important night of her life, Zelani looked at herself one last time in the mirror. The woman reflecting back was no longer the same one the story started with. She was someone completely new, someone who had waited patiently for years for the perfect moment, and that moment had finally arrived. The majestic Grand Sterling Hotel glittered with an elegance that only money can buy. Golden lights reflected in the polished marble lobby, where the crème de la crème of the construction industry had gathered for the most important event of the year. Zelani stepped out of the car with a grace that surprised even herself. The midnight blue dress she had made fit her body perfectly, and the gold embroidery caught the light of the chandeliers in a magical way. Cassius, impeccable in his tuxedo, walked beside her with the confidence of someone who knows all eyes are on him. But this time, eyes were also drawn to his wife, though he didn't seem to notice. Zelani had achieved something she hadn't managed in years, standing out without apparent effort, radiating a natural elegance that was impossible to ignore. The hotel lobby was full of industry personalities. Architects, engineers, investors, and their partners chatted animatedly with glasses of champagne in hand. Zelani recognized several from photographs in trade magazines, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel out of place among them. "Cassius, my friend," boomed a deep voice from the other side of the lobby. The president of the Builders Association, Mr. Washington, approached with open arms. Zelani knew this man was one of the most important figures at the event, and that his recognition could make or break careers. "Mr. Washington, what a pleasure to see you," Cassius replied, with his most charismatic smile. "May I introduce my wife, Zelani?" "Mrs. Sterling, it is an honor to finally meet you," said Mr. Washington, taking Zelani's hand with genuine courtesy. "You look stunning tonight. That dress is a work of art." Zelani felt a warmth she hadn't experienced in years. "Thank you very much, Mr. President. You are very kind." "Where did you find such an exquisite piece? The tailoring is absolutely impeccable." Before Zelani could answer, Cassius intervened with a laugh that pretended to be casual, but sounded forced to her. "Ah, Zelani has her little hobbies. She likes to play with needle and thread." The way he pronounced the word hobbies provoked the familiar feeling of humiliation in Zelani, but this time was different. Instead of shrinking away, she stood taller and smiled with a confidence that surprised both men. "Actually, I designed and made this dress myself," she said in a clear, firm voice. "Sewing isn't a simple hobby for me. It's a passion I've cultivated for years." Mr. Washington looked at her with renewed interest. "Amazing, truly amazing. Do you happen to know the designer Maria Elena Torres, who has done the interior design work for our luxury projects? I think you two should meet. You'd have a lot in common." Cassius remained by her side with an increasingly rigid smile as Mr. Washington continued praising Zelani's work. He wasn't used to his wife receiving this kind of attention, much less her handling it with such elegance. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of more guests. Zelani immediately recognized Naomi, who arrived with 2 colleagues from the firm. She wore a tight black dress that accentuated her athletic figure, and her hair was pulled back in a high ponytail that gave her a sophisticated but cold air. Naomi approached the group with the confidence of someone who knows they are welcome. "Mr. Washington, Cassius, what a joy to see you here," she said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes as her gaze landed briefly on Zelani. "Naomi, you look fantastic tonight," Cassius responded with an enthusiasm that contrasted notably with the coldness with which he had received the compliments toward his wife. Zelani watched the exchange with the attention she had perfected over months. There was a familiarity in the way Cassius pronounced Naomi's name that went beyond professional, and the way Naomi looked at him with barely disguised possessiveness confirmed the suspicions Zelani had been cultivating. "Mrs. Sterling," Naomi finally addressed Zelani with a smile that might have seemed kind to a casual observer. "What an interesting dress. Very homemade." The word homemade was pronounced with the same disdain she had used weeks earlier in their home. Zelani felt the provocation, but kept her composure. "Thank you, Naomi. I designed it especially for this occasion." "What talent," Naomi murmured, though her tone suggested quite the opposite. The tension between the 2 women was palpable, but the men didn't seem to notice. Mr. Washington continued his conversation with Cassius about future projects, while Zelani and Naomi sized each other up like 2 gladiators evaluating an opponent. Over the next hour, this scene repeated several times. Zelani was introduced to various prominent figures of the event, and on every occasion she received sincere compliments for her elegance and her dress. Businessmen, architects, and their wives seemed genuinely impressed by her presence and natural grace. Some even expressed interest in her design and tailoring skills. However, every time Zelani began to shine in a conversation, Cassius found a way to belittle her achievements or divert attention back to himself. And every time Naomi was present, her subtly derogatory comments created an atmosphere of tension that only Zelani could perceive in its entirety. Dinner was served in the hotel's main ballroom, decorated with opulent floral arrangements and illuminated by crystal chandeliers. Zelani was seated at the head table with Cassius and several of the industry's most important couples, with a good view of the stage. Naomi was strategically placed at a nearby table from where she could maintain eye contact with Cassius. During dinner, Zelani actively participated in the conversation, demonstrating knowledge of the sector that surprised many. She had been married to an architect for 15 years. Although Cassius had never valued her opinion, she had absorbed a vast amount of information about the business. Her intelligent comments and pertinent questions earned her the respect of the other diners. "I didn't know Mrs. Sterling was so informed about urban zoning regulations," commented a major investor from the city. "Her insight on the impact of the new legislation is spot on." Cassius laughed nervously. "Zelani listens a lot when I work at home. I guess something rubbed off on her by osmosis." It was again his way of belittling her contribution, making her look like a passive spectator rather than an active participant. But this time, Zelani didn't let it slide. "Actually, I've been studying the legislation on my own," she said with a serene smile. "I think it's important to understand the legal context of the projects my husband undertakes." The conversation continued, and Zelani kept participating with a confidence that grew by the minute. She could feel the admiring glances of the other guests, but she also perceived Cassius's growing discomfort and Naomi's barely contained irritation. After dinner, while dessert and coffee were being served, Zelani excused herself to go to the restroom. She needed a moment to process everything that had happened during the night. For the first time in years, she had felt valued and respected, and the experience was exhilarating. The hotel ladies' lounge was as luxurious as the rest of the facilities. Gold-framed mirrors, polished brass fixtures, and soft lighting that made everyone look their best. As Zelani touched up her makeup, she heard footsteps behind her. "Well, well," said Naomi's voice, "the perfect wife, composing herself for her next act." Zelani turned slowly, without losing the composure she had maintained all night. "Naomi, what a coincidence to find you here." "Coincidence?" Naomi said with a cruel smile. "Nothing I do near Cassius is a coincidence. I think the time has come for us to speak frankly, Zelani." Zelani closed her purse carefully and turned fully to face her. "I'm listening." Naomi took a step closer, invading Zelani's personal space. "Listen to me well, because I'll only say this once. Cassius doesn't love you anymore. He hasn't loved you for months. He's with me because I give him what you can never give him. Passion, intelligence, ambition. You are just an old piece of furniture in his life, something he keeps out of habit." Every word was like a dagger, but Zelani kept an impassive expression. "I know you have feelings for my husband, Naomi, but I'm afraid you are confusing physical attraction with true love." Naomi's laughter echoed in the marble bathroom. "True love? How pathetic you are. Look at yourself in the mirror, Zelani. Look closely. You are a 40-year-old woman who dedicates herself to sewing dresses for the neighbors on the block. You are boring, predictable, and completely insignificant. Cassius is with me because I represent the future, and you are just a reminder of his past mistakes." Zelani felt a wave of rage, but years of training allowed her to maintain control. "If Cassius feels that way, he should have the courage to tell me himself." "Oh, honey, he's told me many things. He's told me how unbearable you've become, how much your mediocrity irritates him, the relief he feels arriving home and not having to pretend he finds you attractive. He said that if it weren't for the legal complications of a divorce, he would have left you years ago." Now Naomi's words had found their target. Zelani felt as if she had been punched in the stomach, but she barely managed to keep her composure. Naomi, interpreting Zelani's silence as a victory, continued her attack. "So here is my offer. For your own good, simply disappear. Ask for the divorce, take the miserable portion of the fortune that corresponds to you, and get out. Otherwise, I will make sure to make your life so miserable you'll have no choice but to leave." Zelani took a deep breath and stood tall. "Naomi, you are overestimating your importance in my husband's life, and you are definitely underestimating my capacity to fight for my marriage." Naomi's smile turned even crueler. "Your marriage? Don't make me laugh. Your marriage is a farce, Zelani, a lie you keep up for appearances. But I am going to end it, and you won't be able to do anything to stop it." In that moment, Naomi committed her biggest mistake. Driven by anger and frustration, she raised her hand and slapped Zelani across the cheek. The sound resonated in the silent bathroom, and Zelani's cheek reddened instantly. "That," Naomi said with satisfaction, "is for daring to defy me. Next time will be much worse." Zelani touched her cheek carefully, feeling the sting. But instead of tears of pain, there was something much more dangerous in her eyes, a cold, calculating determination. "Naomi," she said in a voice that didn't tremble at all, "you just made the biggest mistake of your life." Without waiting for a response, Zelani walked out of the bathroom with all her dignity intact, leaving Naomi alone with her momentary victory. But as she walked down the hallway toward the main ballroom, Zelani knew she had just received the most valuable gift she could have asked for, the perfect justification for what she was about to do. When she returned to the ballroom, several guests immediately noticed the red mark on her cheek. "Zelani, what happened to you?" asked Mr. Washington's wife with genuine concern. Before Zelani could answer, Naomi returned to the hall with a smirk. Cassius, who was speaking with some colleagues, saw the commotion and approached. "What is going on here?" he asked, looking alternately at Zelani and Naomi. Zelani looked her husband directly in the eyes. "Naomi and I had a little altercation in the bathroom. She hit me." The silence that followed was deafening. All nearby guests fell silent to see how Cassius would react to the accusation that his colleague had assaulted his wife. Cassius looked at Zelani's reddened cheek and then at Naomi, who wore an expression of fake innocence. For a moment that seemed like an eternity. Zelani thought her husband was finally going to come to her defense. But then Cassius did something that changed everything forever. He started to laugh. It wasn't a nervous or uncomfortable laugh. It was a genuine guffaw, as if he found the situation truly amusing. "Oh, Zelani, always so dramatic. Surely you bumped into something, and now you're blaming Naomi." The words hit Zelani like a physical blow, but what followed was even worse. Looking at the guests observing the scene with growing discomfort, Cassius added with a cruel smile, "Maybe this way she'll learn her place." The entire hall went silent. Even guests who hadn't witnessed the initial exchange realized something terrible had happened. A woman had accused another of assault, and the husband, instead of comforting or investigating, had chosen to publicly humiliate his own wife. Zelani felt as if the floor were opening beneath her feet. Not only had she been physically assaulted, but now she was humiliated in front of the most important people in the city's business sector. Her husband, the man who had promised to love and protect her, had chosen to laugh at her pain. But while everyone expected Zelani to crumble, she did something completely unexpected. She took a deep breath, stood tall, and with a serenity that left everyone present stunned, said, "You're right, Cassius. I really need to learn what my place is." Without saying another word, Zelani turned around and walked toward the exit of the ballroom. Her steps were firm and decisive. She didn't stop to listen to the murmurs of disapproval some guests directed at Cassius. She left the hotel and headed to the car that had brought them. The driver, waiting in the parking lot, was surprised to see her alone. "Taking you home, Mrs. Sterling?" Zelani sat in the back seat and closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, there was a determination in them she had never shown before. "Yes, please. But first, could you give me a few minutes? I need to make an important call." The driver nodded and withdrew discreetly. Zelani took out her cell phone and dialed the number she knew by heart. "Sequoia, it's Zelani. I know it's late, but we have to execute the plan. Yes, tonight. By tomorrow morning, everything will be ready." She listened attentively to her lawyer friend's response, making a mental note of every detail of what she would have to do in the coming hours. "Perfect. I'll see you at your office at 6 in the morning. Bring all the documents we've prepared. It's going to be a very interesting morning." After hanging up, Zelani asked the driver to take her home. During the ride, she didn't utter a single word, but her mind was working at breakneck speed, reviewing every step of the plan she had been preparing for months. Upon arriving home, Zelani didn't turn on the lights. Instead, she went directly to the study where she had prepared a folder with documents Cassius had never seen. She sat at the desk and, under the light of a small lamp, began to sign the papers with the precision that months of preparation had given her. Every signature was deliberate. Every document had been carefully prepared for this moment. Zelani knew exactly what she was doing, and for the first time in years, she felt she had total control of her destiny. While signing the last document, a smile drew across her lips. It wasn't the submissive smile she had shown for years, but something completely different. It was the smile of a woman who had just found her power and was about to use it in a devastating way. Cassius had chosen to laugh publicly at her pain. Naomi had chosen to attack her physically and verbally. Both had gravely underestimated the woman they thought they knew. But they didn't know the real Zelani. And tomorrow morning, when Cassius woke up, he would discover exactly who his wife really was. If you think Zelani should get revenge, give this story a like. The night had ended, but for Zelani, the real story had just begun. When the alarm marked 5:40 a.m., Zelani opened her eyes. It wasn't the sound that woke her, but the adrenaline that had been coursing through her veins for hours. Beside her, Cassius slept deeply, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to unleash on his life. He had come home past 2 in the morning, smelling of alcohol and a perfume that wasn't his wife's, muttering excuses Zelani no longer needed to hear. She got up with the silent movements she had perfected over years, but this time with a completely different purpose. As she headed to the bathroom, her mind automatically flashed back to 6 months earlier when everything had begun to change. The exact moment was a Tuesday afternoon when she found Cassius in the study reviewing property documents he believed she would never understand. That afternoon, Zelani had entered the study to bring him coffee, as usual. Cassius was focused on his computer with several contracts scattered on the desk. As she approached, he quickly closed a folder and looked at her with irritation. "Can't you knock before entering? I'm dealing with important things you wouldn't understand." Zelani apologized as always and left the coffee cup on the desk. But as she withdrew, something caught her attention. Among the papers Cassius had tried to hide, she saw her signature on a document she didn't remember signing recently. It was only a glimpse, but it was enough to spark her curiosity. That night, when Cassius went out to one of his supposed business meetings, Zelani returned to the study. It took almost an hour to figure out the combination to the safe Cassius thought was secret, but which she had seen him open dozens of times over the years. Inside was a folder marked Joint Properties, and inside that, the information that would completely change her perspective on her marriage. At the beginning of their relationship, when she still fully trusted Cassius, she had signed numerous documents he had presented as mere legal formalities or banking requirements. Zelani had never questioned these documents, believing her husband acted in both their best interests. However, examining each paper carefully, she discovered she was the legal co-owner of assets worth tens of millions of dollars. The discovery was a shock. Not only had she been deceived for years about the true value of their estate, but Cassius had been managing these properties as if they were exclusively his, making crucial financial decisions without consulting her. And most painful of all, using these assets as collateral for business ventures she had no idea about. It was then she decided to contact Sequoia. Sequoia and Zelani had been inseparable in college, both brilliant students with ambitious dreams. While Zelani had opted for the path of early marriage, Sequoia had continued her law studies, specializing in corporate and family law. Now she was a partner at one of the most prestigious firms in the city. Their first meeting took place in a discreet coffee shop downtown, far from the social circles where Cassius might recognize them. Zelani arrived nervous, with copies of all the documents she had found. Sequoia, an elegant woman with short-cropped hair and a piercing gaze, listened to the whole story without interrupting. "Zelani, what you're showing me is more serious than you think," Sequoia said, after reviewing the papers for nearly an hour. "Your husband hasn't just hidden financial information. He has been administering assets that technically and legally don't fully belong to him. This could constitute a form of financial abuse." Sequoia explained that the documents Zelani had signed made her the legal co-owner of 6 commercial properties, 2 plots of land for urban development, and 40% of the shares of the construction firm Cassius ran. The total value was a figure that left Zelani speechless. "But there is something more important you must understand," Sequoia continued. "With the right documentation and correct procedures, not only can you claim your legitimate share of these assets, but potentially you could obtain majority control of several of them. Cassius has been so careless in his paperwork, so sure of your supposed ignorance, that he has left legal loopholes everywhere." Over the following weeks, Zelani began living a double life. By day, she maintained her role as the submissive wife, enduring Cassius's constant humiliations and watching as his relationship with Naomi became increasingly blatant. But by night, after he went out or fell asleep, she studied every document, every contract, every financial transaction she could find. Sequoia provided a discreet team of private investigators and forensic accountants who meticulously tracked every financial move Cassius had made over the last 5 years. What they discovered was a complex web of transactions that had made Cassius considerably wealthy, but always using assets that legally belonged to the couple. Meetings with Sequoia became weekly, always in different locations, and always with maximum discretion. Together, they developed a plan that was as elegant as it was devastating. They would use the very laws and procedures Cassius had used to hide information, but this time against him. The plan consisted of several phases. First, Sequoia prepared all necessary documentation to transfer majority ownership of Sterling Construction to Zelani's name. This was possible because the original documents signed years ago granted a transfer power of attorney that Cassius had completely ignored. Second, they identified all corporate bank accounts linked to properties over which Zelani had legal rights. With the proper documentation, they could freeze these assets until the legal distribution of goods was resolved. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they prepared a civil lawsuit for fraudulent management of marital assets. This would not only recover what legally belonged to Zelani, but could also grant her additional compensation for years of unauthorized management. During this preparation period, Zelani experienced a profound transformation. Every humiliation from Cassius, every derogatory comment, every night he came home late smelling of another woman became fuel for her determination. It was no longer about saving her marriage or regaining her husband's respect. It was about justice. The public humiliation at the awards gala was the final catalyst, but even that had been somewhat anticipated. Sequoia had warned Zelani that it was likely Cassius would increase the level of humiliation as he felt more secure with Naomi, and they had prepared contingency plans for various scenarios. Now, at 6 a.m, standing in her bathroom, Zelani was ready to execute the final phase of the plan. She had an appointment at 7 at Sequoia's office, where she would sign the final documents and activate the bank transfers that would change everything forever. She dressed with care, choosing a navy blue power suit that projected authority and professionalism. She was no longer the submissive woman of years past. Today, she would officially become Zelani Sterling, businesswoman and majority shareholder of one of the city's most important real estate empires. While applying her makeup, her phone vibrated with a message from Sequoia. "All ready, papers prepared, bank team on standby. Today your life changes, friend." Zelani replied with a simplicity that hid years of planning. "On my way." She went down the stairs in silence, careful not to wake Cassius. In the kitchen, she made coffee, as she had done thousands of times. But this would be the last time, as the ignorant and submissive wife Cassius believed she was. While waiting for the coffee to brew, she checked one last time a small travel bag she had discreetly packed over the last week. Inside were personal documents, some jewelry inherited from her mother, and enough clothes for a few days. She didn't pack much because where she was going, she wouldn't need the possessions of her previous life. Sequoia had arranged for Zelani to stay in a corporate apartment the firm kept for important clients in delicate situations. It was an elegant and discreet place where she could live while the legal aspects of the property transfer were resolved. At 6:30, Zelani left the house with just her small suitcase and her purse. A car sent by Sequoia was waiting for her at the end of the street with a discreet driver who asked no questions. As the car pulled away from what had been her home for 15 years, Zelani didn't look back once. The ride to Sequoia's firm took 20 minutes. Through a city that was barely starting to wake up, Zelani used the time to mentally review every step of the plan they were about to execute. There was no margin for error. Every detail had been carefully prepared for months. Sequoia's firm occupied 3 floors of a modern skyscraper in the financial district. Sequoia received her personally in the lobby, impeccable in a business suit, with an expression that was a mix of professionalism and genuine satisfaction for what they were about to achieve. "Good morning, Madam President," Sequoia said, with a smile that made Zelani realize the magnitude of what was happening. Good morning, counselor. Ready? More than ready. I've set everything up in the boardroom. The bank team is connected via video conference, and the official documents await your signature. They went up in a silent elevator to the executive floor. Zelani felt strangely calm, as if all the tension of the last months had dissipated. Finally, the moment to act had arrived. The boardroom was impressive, with a mahogany table for 20 people and panoramic windows offering a spectacular view of the Chicago skyline. On the table lay several folders of documents, each carefully labeled and organized. Sequoia began to explain while pouring coffee into fine china cups. Zelani, what we are going to do today is a series of completely legal property transfers based on the documents your own husband made you sign for years. Ironically, his own strategy to control the marital estate is what now allows us to transfer that control to you. The first set of documents designated Zelani as the majority shareholder of Sterling Construction, the company Cassius had built over the last decade. The second set transferred the most valuable commercial properties in the family portfolio to her name. The third froze all corporate bank accounts until the financial audit they had requested was completed. Every signature from Zelani was deliberate and firm. With every document she completed, she felt herself transforming from victim to protagonist of her own story. Sequoia had coordinated everything so the transfers would execute simultaneously at 8 in the morning, when banks opened and corporate systems went live. At 8 o'clock sharp, Zelani signed the last document. Immediately, Sequoia activated the call with the bank representatives waiting on the line. Gentlemen, can you proceed with the transfers? All documentation is in order and duly signed. Over the next 30 minutes, Zelani watched as her life transformed completely through a series of electronic transactions. Accounts that had been under Cassius's exclusive control were frozen. Shares he believed he owned were transferred. Properties he had managed as his changed owners officially. Sequoia, who had been monitoring the whole process from her computer, finally turned to Zelani with a triumphant smile. Done. You are officially the majority shareholder of Sterling Construction and have legal control of assets worth approximately $35 million. Zelani felt a mixture of euphoria and surrealism. In a single morning, she had gone from a humiliated wife to one of the most powerful women in the city's real estate sector. How long will it take Cassius to notice? She asked. Sequoia looked at her watch. He probably already knows. Banking systems send automatic notifications when a corporate account is frozen. His day is going to start very differently than he planned. While they spoke, Sequoia's phone rang. It was one of her contacts at the main bank where Cassius managed the corporate accounts. The conversation was brief, but when she hung up, Sequoia had an expression of satisfaction. He just tried to access the company's main account to make a transfer. The system denied him access and informed him he must contact the bank's legal department. He also tried to access his corporate email, but access has been blocked by court order. Zelani walked to the panoramic window and gazed at the city stretching before her. From this perspective, everything looked different. She was no longer the invisible wife of a successful architect. She was Zelani Sterling, businesswoman in her own right, with the power to make decisions that would affect not only her future, but that of hundreds of employees and dozens of real estate projects. Sequoia approached and handed her an additional folder. These are the documents for the new board of directors that will take charge of the company. I've selected a team of top-tier professionals who can help you manage the transition without affecting ongoing projects. There is also a proposal to completely restructure the administrative leadership. Zelani examined the documents with attention. Every name, every proposal, every strategy had been carefully considered to guarantee not only the survival of the company, but its growth under new management. "And Naomi?" she asked finally. Sequoia smiled with an almost predatory expression. "Naomi has a temporary contract that expires in 2 months. Legally, the new management can decide not to renew it without giving specific explanations, but frankly, when she finds out what happened, she'll likely resign herself." During the next 2 hours, Zelani and Sequoia went over every aspect of the new situation. They prepared the press release announcing the leadership change, documents to be sent to employees and clients, and a strategy to handle the inevitable media inquiries. At 11 in the morning, Sequoia received another call from her contact at the bank. Cassius had shown up personally at the bank with his lawyer, demanding an explanation for the freezing of his accounts. He was informed that all documentation was in order, and any inquiry should be directed to the new majority holder of the corporate accounts. "Did they tell him who the new owner is?" Zelani asked. "Not yet. That information will only be provided when he submits a formal written request. It will probably take him until this afternoon to figure out it's you." Zelani nodded. That gave her enough time to complete the final preparations. Sequoia had scheduled a meeting at 3 in the afternoon with key company staff, where Zelani would be officially introduced as the new president. She had also scheduled a professional photo shoot at 4, where images would be taken to accompany the press release and social media updates. Zelani needed a completely new public image, consistent with her new role. At noon, they went to a luxury restaurant where Sequoia had reserved a private dining room. It was important for Zelani to eat well and keep her energy up for what would be a long and emotionally exhausting day. During lunch, Sequoia explained the legal aspects of what might happen in the coming days. It was likely Cassius would try to challenge the transfer, but the documentation was solid, and he himself had created the legal precedents now being used against him. "It's also likely he'll try to contact you directly," Sequoia said. "It's best that all communication goes through the firm. It is crucial you maintain emotional distance in this situation and not allow him to manipulate or threaten you." Zelani knew Sequoia was right. She knew Cassius well enough to know his first reaction would be anger, followed by attempts at manipulation. And finally, when he realized the gravity of the situation, there would be desperate attempts at negotiation. After lunch, they returned to the firm, where Zelani spent the afternoon in meetings with the team that would manage her new company. Each person had been carefully selected, not just for their professional ability, but for their integrity and ability to handle such a delicate transition. At 5 in the afternoon, when Zelani was finally resting in her new temporary office at the firm, Sequoia entered with an expression that was a mix of amusement and satisfaction. "I just received a very interesting call," she said. "Cassius finally found out it's you controlling everything. Apparently, he yelled so much at the bank that they had to call security. Has he tried to contact us?" "He has called 17 times in the last hour. He sent 12 emails, and according to the building guard, he stood for 40 minutes at our office door before being informed he couldn't come up without an appointment." Zelani felt a mix of satisfaction and a strange sensation of almost pity. After nearly 15 years of humiliation, of being treated as invisible, of enduring infidelity and contempt, it was hard to feel true compassion for the man who was now experiencing a fraction of the confusion and helplessness she had felt for so long. When the sun began to set, Zelani finally left the firm and headed to her new temporary home. The apartment Sequoia had secured for her was in one of the city's most exclusive buildings, with panoramic views and all the amenities she would need in the coming weeks. As the car drove to her new residence, Zelani reflected on everything that had changed in the last 24 hours. Yesterday morning, she was an invisible, humiliated wife in her own life. Today, she was a powerful businesswoman, controlling the real estate empire she had unknowingly helped build. Her personal phone, which she had kept on silent all day, showed 32 missed calls from Cassius. She had also received 6 text messages, each more desperate than the last. The last one, sent 20 minutes ago, simply said, "Zelani, please, we need to talk." Zelani read the message, and without reading the others, deleted them all. They had had 15 years to talk, and in those 15 years he had chosen to humiliate her, belittle her, and betray her. The time for conversation was over. Upon arriving at her new home, Zelani poured herself a glass of wine and sat in front of the panoramic window offering a spectacular view of the illuminated city. From there, she could see the lights of several buildings that now belonged to her, projects she had unknowingly helped finance and would now manage with full knowledge and control. For the first time in years, Zelani felt completely at peace. The woman who had been publicly humiliated the night before no longer existed. In her place had emerged someone completely new, a powerful, independent woman determined to build her own future. Tomorrow her new life would officially begin. But tonight, as the city shined before her like the kingdom she had just conquered, Zelani Sterling simply smiled and toasted in silence to the justice that had finally been served. At 8:30 in the morning, Cassius woke up to the sound of his phone. It wasn't his usual alarm, but an insistent call that pulled him from the deep sleep induced by the previous night's alcohol. He reached for the nightstand, hoping, as always, that Zelani would be up, but the bed was empty. "She's probably already down making breakfast," he thought with irritation as he answered. "Mr. Sterling, this is the director of your corporate bank. We need to speak urgently about your company accounts." Cassius sat up slowly, still affected by the hangover. "What about the accounts? Is there a problem with the transfers scheduled for today?" "Sir, all corporate accounts related to Sterling Construction have been frozen by court order. We cannot process any transactions until the legal situation is resolved." The words fell on Cassius like a bucket of ice water. "Court order? What are you talking about? Those are my accounts. It's my company." "Mr. Sterling, you need to come to the bank immediately. There is documentation you must review. Access permissions to all corporate accounts have also been modified." Cassius hung up and rushed to the bathroom. His mind was racing, trying to understand what had happened. A court order? Who would have requested his accounts be frozen? A dissatisfied client? A problem with the IRS? While showering quickly, he yelled toward the bedroom. "Zelani, come up a moment. I have a problem." The silence that followed was strange. Usually, she responded instantly, but this time there was no answer. He came out of the bathroom wrapped in a towel and went down to look for her. The house was empty. There was no trace of the usual breakfast in the kitchen, no coffee brewed, no fresh orange juice, no newspaper placed at his spot on the table. It was as if Zelani had simply vanished. He ran upstairs to dress, calling his wife on the phone while putting on a shirt. The call rang several times before going to voicemail. He called again, same result. On the third attempt, it went straight to voicemail as if she had turned off the phone. An hour later, Cassius was sitting in front of his bank manager. The glass-walled office made him feel exposed and vulnerable. On the table was a thick folder of documents the manager had been explaining for the last 20 minutes. "I don't understand. These documents show my wife as co-owner of properties that are mine. There has to be a mistake." The manager, a middle-aged man with a serious expression, shook his head. "Mr. Sterling, we have reviewed all documentation 3 times. Your wife has legal rights over these properties based on the documents you yourself presented to the bank over the last 10 years. The contracts are signed by both parties, and the transfer of title has been processed legally." Cassius picked up one of the documents and examined it closely. It was true. He recognized his signature and Zelani's, but he didn't remember signing anything that gave her control of his company accounts. "But this doesn't give her the right to freeze my accounts without my consent." The manager cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mr. Sterling, according to the documentation we received this morning, your wife now owns 60% of the shares of Sterling Construction. As majority shareholder, she has the legal authority to make financial decisions regarding the company." Cassius's world stopped. 60%? That's impossible. It's the company I founded, that I built with my own hands. "Sir, you must understand the bank is obligated to comply with the legal orders we receive. If you wish to challenge this situation, you will need to seek independent legal representation." Cassius left the bank in a state of shock. His first instinct was to head to his company offices, but upon arrival, he found an unexpected scene. In reception, there were people he didn't recognize, dressed in executive suits, speaking quietly with his usual employees. "Mr. Sterling," approached his faithful secretary of the last 8 years, "I have received instructions that you no longer have authorized access to the premises." "What do you mean I don't have access? This is my company. We have received legal documentation regarding the change in ownership structure this morning. The new management has assumed all operations." Cassius looked around at the offices that had been his kingdom for years. Employees looked at him with a mix of confusion and pity. Some whispered among themselves, clearly in possession of information he was unaware of. "Where is Naomi?" he asked finally. "She left an hour ago, sir. She said she had an important meeting." Cassius took out his phone and dialed Naomi's number. Just like with Zelani, the call went directly to voicemail. He tried again, same result. For the next few hours, Cassius wandered the city like a lost soul, trying to understand what had happened to his life. He visited his personal lawyer, who explained that the documentation appeared legally valid, and he would need time to investigate his possible options. He went to 3 other banks where he kept personal accounts, only to discover that several of them had also been frozen due to being linked to the disputed properties. Late in the afternoon, exhausted and desperate, he headed to the apartment he had secretly rented for his encounters with Naomi. He had a key and hoped to find her there. He hoped she could help him understand what was happening. When he opened the door, he found the apartment empty. Completely empty. Not only Naomi, but all her belongings had disappeared. The clothes she kept in the closet, her cosmetics in the bathroom, even the photos they had taken together. It was as if she had never been there. His phone rang. It was an unknown number, but he answered hoping it was Naomi from another phone. "Cassius!" It was Naomi's voice, but it sounded distant and cold. "Naomi, thank God. Where are you? I need to see you. Something terrible has happened." "Cassius, I have something to tell you. I heard what happened with the company." "You heard? How? Where are you?" There was a long pause before Naomi answered. "At the airport. A competing firm in Atlanta has offered me a position." "What? What are you talking about? When did you decide that?" Naomi sighed, a barely audible sound. "Cassius, I can't be with someone who doesn't have a professional future. What we had was exciting when you were successful, when you had power. But now what, Naomi? This is temporary. I'll get it all back." "No, Cassius, you're not going to get anything back. And honestly, after seeing how you treated your wife last night, I realized the kind of man you are. If you could humiliate her like that publicly, what guarantees you wouldn't do the same to me?" Cassius felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. "Naomi, please, I love you. We can get through this together." Naomi's laughter was cold and cruel. "Love, Cassius? What we had wasn't love. It was mutual convenience. I had access to important contacts, and you had the thrill of being with a younger woman. But now that you have nothing to offer me, there's no reason to continue." The call cut off. Cassius tried to call back, but the phone was disconnected. He stood alone in the empty apartment, surrounded by the silence of a life that had collapsed in less than 24 hours. For the first time in years, Cassius had to face the reality of who he was without the power, money, and company that had defined his identity. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, in one of New York City's most luxurious hotels, Zelani was preparing for what would be one of the most important moments of her new career. The International Conference of Women Leaders in Real Estate was held every 2 years, and this year Zelani had been invited as one of the keynote speakers. The invitation had arrived 3 days after she assumed control of the company. Sequoia had been working discreetly with her industry contacts to position Zelani not as the wife who had inherited a company, but as the strategist who had been behind the success of Sterling Construction for years. In the hotel suite, Zelani adjusted the champagne-colored suit jacket in front of the mirror, which she had designed especially for the occasion. It was elegant but powerful, feminine but authoritative. Every detail had been conceived to project the image of a woman who belonged by nature to the highest echelons of corporate power. The title of her presentation, Real Estate Investment Strategies in Emerging Markets, had been prepared for weeks. But beyond the data and financial projections, Zelani knew it would be her personal story that would truly captivate the audience. The main auditorium of the convention center was full with over 500 businesswomen from all over the country. When Zelani took the stage, she was greeted with applause that surprised her with its warmth and duration. Clearly, her story had already begun to circulate in business circles. For the next 45 minutes, Zelani not only shared her investment strategies, but also her perspective on female empowerment in a sector traditionally dominated by men. She spoke of the importance of financial literacy, the need for women to take active control of their own assets, and how to turn personal adversity into professional opportunity. But it was during the Q&A session that the moment arrived which would define her new public image. A journalist from a specialized magazine stood up and asked, "Mrs. Sterling, many in the industry wonder how you managed to take control of such a consolidated company so quickly and effectively. Could you share the details of that transition?" Zelani smiled with the confidence that had grown exponentially in recent weeks. The transition wasn't quick at all. It was the result of years of careful observation, silent education, and strategic planning. Although many saw me simply as the wife of a successful businessman, for 15 years I was learning, studying, and preparing for the moment when I could actively contribute to the growth of our projects. Are you saying you always intended to assume leadership of the company? Not exactly, but I would say I always knew I had the skills and vision necessary to contribute in a meaningful way. When the opportunity presented itself to take a more active role, I was completely prepared for it. Another journalist raised her hand. "Mrs. Sterling, rumor has it your rise in the company was preceded by a difficult personal situation. How do you manage the balance between personal challenges and professional responsibilities?" Zelani paused, knowing this was the question she had been waiting for. "I think all strong women face a moment where they have to decide if they are going to let circumstances define them or if they are going to take control. For me, personal challenges weren't an obstacle, but the catalyst that motivated me to demonstrate my true potential." The audience erupted in applause. Zelani had managed to transform what could have been seen as the story of a messy divorce into a narrative of empowerment and personal triumph. After the presentation, she was surrounded by dozens of businesswomen who wanted to meet her, exchange contacts, and explore collaboration opportunities. Several international companies expressed interest in partnering with Sterling Construction under her new leadership. That night, at the conference gala dinner, Zelani was recognized as Emerging Businesswoman of the Year. The award not only brought her prestige, but also international contacts that would completely change the scope of her company. Over the following days, while participating in workshops and bilateral meetings, Zelani received project proposals in London, Milan, and Paris. Her vision of expanding the company beyond national borders was beginning to materialize in a way she had never imagined. It was during a private dinner with some Italian investors that she received the call she had been waiting for. Sequoia contacted her with news on legal progress back home. "Zelani, Cassius has finally agreed to a meeting to discuss the terms of the separation. His lawyer got in touch this afternoon. It seems he has understood the situation is irreversible and wants to negotiate a solution that allows him to keep a minimum of dignity." What kind of proposal are they making? Basically, he is willing to accept an uncontested divorce in exchange for financial compensation that allows him to start over. He also wants confidentiality regarding the details of the asset division. Zelani contemplated the proposal looking at the lights of New York from the restaurant terrace. "What do you think, Sequoia?" "Honestly, I think it's the best solution. You keep total control of the company without prolonged litigation, and he gets enough money to rebuild his career if he wishes. It's a win-win. Proceed with the negotiation, but I want to make it clear that any agreement must include a non-compete clause prohibiting him from working in the local real estate sector for the next 5 years." "Understood. When do you plan to return?" "In a week. I have 3 more meetings here that could result in major contracts for international expansion." After hanging up, Zelani stayed alone on the terrace, reflecting on the extraordinary journey she had undertaken in recent weeks. From public humiliation at the awards gala to becoming one of the most respected voices in the real estate sector. A week later, Zelani returned home to face a completely transformed world. The company operated with an efficiency it had never had under Cassius's direction. Employees seemed more motivated, clients expressed greater satisfaction, and financial indicators showed steady growth. Her new office, located on the executive floor of the corporate building, now had panoramic views of a city she knew from a completely different perspective. From there, she could see several of the projects she was developing, including a luxury residential complex that had become the most sought-after development in the city. 3 months after taking control of the company, Zelani was in her new home, a penthouse she had bought in one of the most exclusive buildings in the city. It was Saturday afternoon, and she was on the terrace tending to her orchid garden, a hobby that had started as a pastime and become a passion. The intercom interrupted her. It was the concierge alerting her that a journalist was downstairs, wishing to interview her for an article on successful businesswomen. The journalist was a veteran specialized in corporate profiles for a national business magazine. She was an elegant woman in her 50s, known for asking tough but fair questions. They sat on the terrace surrounded by blooming orchids and with a breathtaking view of the city. The journalist had prepared questions about corporate strategy, expansion plans, and leadership philosophy, but Zelani knew the most interesting question would come at the end. "Mrs. Sterling," said the journalist after an hour of technical conversation. "There is a question many of our readers will want to ask. Your transformation from housewife to leading businesswoman is astounding. Some critics suggest you had an unfair advantage or took advantage of a complex legal situation. How do you respond to those claims?" Zelani smiled, caressing an orchid that had just bloomed that week. "I think that perspective reflects precisely the kind of bias we women face in the business world. The reality is that for 15 years, I was involved in every major decision of the company, just from a position that wasn't officially recognized. When I assumed formal control, it wasn't because I took advantage of an unfair advantage, but because I finally claimed recognition for the contribution I had been making for years." "But you will admit the timing was convenient." Zelani paused, knowing this was her opportunity to set the official record of her story. There is something people don't understand about that moment. It wasn't a matter of convenient timing. It was a matter of strategic patience. "Could you explain that?" "For years I observed how the company was managed. I learned about every facet of the business and educated myself on legal and financial aspects that many husbands assume their wives don't understand. When I decided to act, it wasn't an emotional reaction to a difficult personal situation, but the execution of a plan I had carefully developed." "Are you saying you planned this transition for years?" "I'm saying I prepared for years to be ready when the right moment arrived. Some might call it planning, others might call it prudence. I call it personal responsibility." The journalist leaned forward, clearly intrigued. "And how did you know that moment had arrived?" Zelani looked at the city stretching before her. Then she looked back at the journalist. "When I realized it was no longer about saving a marriage or a partnership, but about protecting a legacy I had helped build, in that moment, I knew I had to act." "One last question, Mrs. Sterling. Many women who might be in similar situations to what you lived through will be reading this interview. What advice would you give them?" Zelani considered her answer carefully. "I would tell them that patience is not passivity, and preparation is power. Sometimes circumstances force us to act, but if we have used our time wisely, we will be prepared when that moment comes." "And how do you know when is the right moment to act?" Zelani smiled with an expression that was a mix of wisdom and satisfaction. "That is the wrong question. It's not about waiting for the right moment. It's about calculating the exact moment." After the journalist left, Zelani remained alone on the terrace, contemplating the city she now viewed from a completely new perspective. The sun was beginning to set, creating a spectacular play of colors reflecting off the glass buildings she had helped finance and build. Her phone vibrated with a message from Sequoia. "Divorce papers finalized. Cassius has accepted all terms. You are officially free." Zelani read the message, and without replying, put it away. Freedom hadn't started with a divorce paper. It had started the night she decided to stop being invisible in her own life. She stood up and approached the orchids that had bloomed spectacularly in recent months. She had learned they required patience, precision, and exact knowledge of when to apply each type of care. It wasn't much different from what her own transformation had required. While watering each plant with care, Zelani reflected on the extraordinary journey she had undertaken. From being the invisible woman in her marriage to becoming one of the most respected businesswomen in the country, from enduring silent humiliations to presiding over international conferences on female empowerment. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned the difference between waiting and calculating. For years she had believed she was waiting for things to improve, for Cassius to change, for her marriage to fix itself. But in reality, she had been calculating, observing, learning, and preparing for the moment when all the pieces fit together. As the last rays of sun disappeared behind the city buildings, Zelani smiled with a sense of complete satisfaction. It wasn't about waiting for the perfect moment. It was about calculating the exact moment to claim the life she had always deserved. In her new world, Zelani Sterling was no longer the woman who endured humiliations in silence. She was the architect of her own destiny, the president of her own company, and the author of a story of transformation that inspired women across a continent. And as the city lights turned on one by one, illuminating the projects she now directed and the dreams she was building, Zelani knew her true story had only just begun. Did you like the story, and which city are you listening from? Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.